The cemetery was silent except for the sound of rain drumming against expensive umbrellas. I stood at the edge of my father's grave, staring at the mahogany casket being lowered into the earth when I felt hands on my back. Before I could turn around, I was falling, tumbling into the dark hole that was supposed to hold only my father's body. The last thing I saw before hitting the ground was my stepmother's face peering down at me, a cold smile playing at her lips. But what she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the helpless girl they thought they were burying had just inherited something that would change everything. Before the story begins, please leave us a comment telling us which state or city you are watching from. Do not forget to like and subscribe so this channel can grow and bring you more exciting stories. My name is Elena, and for 23 years I believed I was nobody. I grew up thinking my father was a middle-class accountant who worked long hours and traveled frequently for business. My mother died when I was 5, and I have only scattered memories of her: the scent of jasmine perfume, the sound of her laughter, the way she used to braid my hair before bed. After she passed, it was just my father and me, living in a modest two-bedroom apartment in a quiet suburb. He was loving but distant, always preoccupied with work, always apologizing for missing school events and birthday parties. I learned early not to ask for much, not to expect his presence, because his absence was the price we paid for survival, or so I thought. Everything changed 3 years ago when my father remarried. Victoria came into our lives like a whirlwind, beautiful and sophisticated, 15 years younger than my father, with impeccable taste and an air of confidence that filled every room she entered. She wore designer clothes I couldn't pronounce the names of, and carried handbags that probably cost more than my entire wardrobe. I remember the first time I met her at a restaurant that required reservations weeks in advance, where the menu had no prices and the waiter spoke in hushed, reverent tones. My father seemed different around her, lighter somehow, as if her presence lifted a weight I hadn't known he carried. He laughed more, smiled more, touched her hand across the table with a tenderness I rarely saw him display. I wanted to be happy for him, to embrace this new chapter in his life, but something about Victoria made my skin crawl. The way she looked at me when my father wasn't watching, the false sweetness in her voice when she asked about my studies, the subtle comments about my appearance and my choices that seemed helpful on the surface, but left me feeling small and inadequate. They married quickly within 6 months of meeting, and Victoria moved into our apartment. Except it didn't stay our apartment for long. Within weeks, my father announced we were moving to a real house with a yard and multiple floors and rooms I would get lost in for the first few weeks. I was stunned. How could we afford this? My father had always claimed money was tight, that we needed to be careful with our spending, that my college fund could only stretch so far. But now, we were living in a home that belonged in a magazine, with furniture that looked like art and a kitchen bigger than our entire old apartment. When I asked about it, my father simply said he'd been saving for years, that he wanted to give me a better life, that Victoria had helped him see he'd been too cautious with money. I accepted the explanation because I wanted to believe it, because the alternative was too confusing to contemplate. Victoria brought her daughter with her, Sophia, who was 2 years younger than me, and everything I wasn't. She was stunning, with perfect skin and perfect hair, and a perfect figure that she showed off in clothes that always seemed just slightly too revealing. She was charming and vivacious, the kind of person who commanded attention the moment she walked into a room. My father doted on her immediately, treating her like the daughter he'd always wanted, or so it felt to me in my darker moments. He praised her accomplishments, attended her events, bought her gifts that made my own birthday presents look like afterthoughts. I told myself I wasn't jealous, that I was mature enough to share my father's affection, that having a sister could be a good thing after all these years of being alone. But the truth was I felt invisible. I'd always been my father's priority, his reason for working so hard, and now I was just the awkward, bookish girl who faded into the background while Sophia sparkled. The change in our lifestyle accelerated after the move. Suddenly, we were taking vacations to places I'd only seen in travel documentaries. We ate at restaurants where the bill for one meal could have fed me for a month. Victoria redecorated constantly, bringing in designers and contractors to create the perfect aesthetic for each room. My father never said no to her, never questioned the expense, never seemed concerned about the money flowing out like water. I started to suspect something wasn't right, that perhaps my father's business was more successful than he'd ever let on. But whenever I tried to ask him about it, he'd brush me off with vague answers about good investments and lucky breaks. The more I pushed, the more distant he became, until I learned to stop asking altogether. It was easier to accept the new reality than to chase answers that clearly weren't meant for me. My relationship with Victoria deteriorated rapidly once we lived under the same roof. She was different when my father wasn't around, colder and more calculating, her mask of warmth slipping to reveal something hard and mercenary underneath. She criticized everything about me, my choice of clothing, my hairstyle, my lack of social grace, my focus on academics instead of appearance. She made it clear I was a disappointment, a burden she tolerated only because of my father. Sophia followed her mother's lead, treating me with barely concealed contempt, mocking my interests and my friends, spreading rumors about me at the private school my father had enrolled us in. I became isolated, trapped in a house that should have been a home, but felt more like a battlefield where I was perpetually outgunned. I retreated into my studies, spending as much time as possible in the library or at coffee shops, anywhere but the house, where I was reminded daily of how little I belonged. My father seemed oblivious to the tension, or perhaps he simply chose not to see it. He was traveling more than ever now, sometimes for weeks at a time, leaving me alone with Victoria and Sophia. When he was home, he was distracted, always on his phone, always in his office with the door closed, having hushed conversations I wasn't meant to hear. The few times I tried to talk to him about how I was feeling, about how Victoria treated me, he dismissed my concerns as normal family adjustment issues, telling me to be patient, to try harder to get along, to remember that Victoria and Sophia had made sacrifices too in joining our family. I felt betrayed by his refusal to see what was happening right in front of him, but I also understood on some level that he was happy, happier than I had ever seen him, and I didn't want to be the person who took that away from him. So I stayed silent and counted down the days until I could leave for college, where I could finally escape the gilded cage my life had become. College became my refuge. I threw myself into my studies with an intensity that worried my professors and the few friends I managed to make. I majored in business and finance, driven by a need to understand the world my father inhabited, to make sense of the money that had transformed our lives. I took every scholarship I could find, worked part-time jobs to minimize how much I needed to ask my father for, determined to be as independent as possible. I went home only for major holidays, and even then I tried to cut my visits short, unable to bear the sight of Victoria and Sophia playing house with my father, acting like the perfect family I could never be part of. My father noticed my absence but didn't fight it, didn't demand I come home more often, which hurt more than any of Victoria's barbs. It was as if he'd already replaced me, found a better daughter in Sophia, and my presence was no longer required. Then, 3 months ago, I got the call that shattered everything. My father had collapsed during a business trip. He was in the hospital, unconscious. The doctors weren't sure if he would wake up. I drove through the night to get to him, my hands shaking on the wheel, my mind racing through every regret and unsaid word that haunted our relationship. By the time I arrived, Victoria and Sophia were already there, occupying his room like sentries, making it clear with their cold stares that I was an intruder. My father lay in the bed, pale and still, attached to machines that beeped and hummed with mechanical indifference. I wanted to hold his hand, to tell him I loved him despite everything, but Victoria positioned herself between us, her body a physical barrier to the goodbye I desperately needed. The doctor spoke in grave tones about his condition, using words like critical and uncertain prognosis, and I realized with crushing clarity that I might lose him before I ever really knew him. He lingered for 2 weeks, never regaining consciousness, his body slowly shutting down, despite the best efforts of a medical team that seemed to materialize out of nowhere. I later learned they were specialists flown in from around the country, the kind of doctors who typically treated celebrities and politicians, not middle-class accountants. It should have been my first clue that nothing about my father's life was what it seemed, but I was too consumed with grief to question the inconsistencies piling up around me. Victoria controlled every aspect of those final days, deciding who could visit and when, making medical decisions without consulting me, treating me like a distant relative rather than his daughter. I fought her at every turn, demanding my right to be involved, but she had paperwork, legal documents that named her as his healthcare proxy and decision maker. My father had given her that power, had chosen her over me even in matters of life and death, and that knowledge was almost as painful as losing him. When he finally died, I felt nothing at first, just a strange emptiness where the grief should have been. I sat by his body for hours after the machines were turned off, studying his face, trying to memorize features I'd barely paid attention to in life. He looked peaceful, younger somehow, as if death had lifted a burden he'd carried for decades. I wondered what secrets had died with him, what truths I would never know now that he was gone. Victoria eventually had security escort me out of the room, claiming I was disturbing the process, that the hospital needed to prepare the body. I went without protest, too numb to fight anymore, too exhausted to care. I drove back to my apartment in a daze, barely aware of the traffic around me, and collapsed into bed fully clothed, sleeping for 16 hours straight. The funeral arrangements happened without my input. Victoria planned everything, selecting the cemetery, the casket, the flowers, the service, as if I didn't exist. When I tried to be involved, she shut me down with cold efficiency, reminding me that as his widow, she had legal authority over all decisions related to his death. She chose a cemetery I'd never heard of, in a part of town I didn't recognize, far from where we'd lived when I was growing up. She selected a plot in a section reserved for what the cemetery director called distinguished families, surrounded by mausoleums and monuments that spoke of old money and established lineage. It seemed wrong, inappropriate for the man I'd known as my father, but Victoria insisted it was what he would have wanted, that he had actually pre-selected the location himself. I didn't believe her, but I had no proof, no way to challenge her claims about my own father's wishes. The funeral itself was surreal. Hundreds of people attended, filling the cemetery with black umbrellas and expensive suits, faces I'd never seen before, coming to mourn a man they claimed to know. They told stories about my father that didn't match the person I'd grown up with, speaking of his generosity and his vision, his impact on industries and communities, his legacy that would endure for generations. I stood apart from it all, feeling like I'd stumbled into someone else's funeral, like the man in the casket was a stranger who happened to share my father's face. Victoria played the grieving widow to perfection, dabbing at her eyes with a silk handkerchief, accepting condolences with graceful sorrow, leaning on Sophia for support in a tableau of maternal vulnerability. No one approached me, no one offered comfort or acknowledged my loss, as if I was a ghost haunting the proceedings rather than the deceased's only biological child. The service was long and formal, filled with religious rituals I didn't recognize, and eulogies from people who spoke about aspects of my father's life I knew nothing about. A man I'd never met talked about my father's philanthropy, the millions he'd donated to causes he cared about, the foundations he'd established to help underprivileged youth access education. Millions. The word echoed in my head as I tried to reconcile it with the man who'd claimed we couldn't afford a new winter coat, who'd made me apply for financial aid for college, who'd lived in a modest apartment for 18 years. Another speaker discussed my father's business empire, the companies he'd founded and sold, the investments that had made him one of the wealthiest men in the state. Wealthy. Not comfortable, not successful, but wealthy, billionaire wealthy, based on the numbers being casually mentioned. I felt dizzy, disconnected from reality, as if I'd woken up in an alternate universe where nothing made sense. When it was time to lower the casket, I stood at the edge of the grave, staring down into the earth that would be my father's final resting place. The rain had intensified, turning the ground muddy and treacherous, but I didn't care. I needed to be close to him one last time, needed this moment of goodbye that had been stolen from me at the hospital. I was vaguely aware of people moving around me, of the cemetery workers preparing the mechanism that would lower the casket, of Victoria standing a few feet away, watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. I was so lost in my grief and confusion that I didn't notice her moving closer until I felt her hands on my back, pressing firmly between my shoulder blades. For a split second, I thought she was offering comfort, a rare moment of humanity from a woman who'd shown me nothing but cruelty. Then she pushed, hard, and I was falling forward into the grave. Time seemed to slow as I tumbled into the hole, my arms flailing uselessly, my mouth open in a scream that never came. I saw the casket rushing up to meet me, the polished wood that would break my fall or my body. I wasn't sure which. I hit the surface hard, my shoulder taking most of the impact, pain exploding through my upper body. I rolled off the casket onto the dirt beside it, gasping for air, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. Above me, framed against the gray sky, I saw Victoria's face peering down, and for just an instant before she schooled her features into shock, I saw satisfaction in her eyes, a cold triumph that made my blood run ice. Then she was screaming, calling for help, claiming I'd slipped on the wet ground, that it was a terrible accident, her voice full of fake concern that made me want to vomit. People rushed to the edge of the grave, faces appearing above me like a bizarre audience. Someone lowered a ladder, and hands reached down to help me climb out, but I was shaking so hard I could barely grip the rungs. A paramedic who'd been on standby for the elderly attendees examined me, checking for broken bones and signs of concussion. I had bruises, a possibly sprained shoulder, cuts and scrapes from the impact, but nothing life-threatening. I insisted I was fine, that I just needed a moment, but the truth was I was far from fine. Victoria had just tried to kill me or at the very least seriously harm me, and she'd done it in front of hundreds of witnesses who'd all accepted her explanation of an unfortunate slip. I wanted to scream the truth, to accuse her in front of everyone, but I knew how it would sound, like the ravings of a grief-stricken daughter looking for someone to blame. So I kept silent, letting them help me to my feet, accepting the murmured sympathies and suggestions that I go home and rest. Victoria approached me as I was being led away, putting a hand on my arm with false gentleness. She spoke in a low voice that only I could hear, her lips barely moving, her face a mask of concern for anyone watching. She told me I should leave now, that I'd embarrassed myself enough for one day, that the reading of the will was for family only, and I'd be notified if I was mentioned. The venom in her quiet words, the clear dismissal, the implication that I wasn't family, lit a fire in my chest that burned away the shock and fear. I pulled my arm from her grasp and looked her directly in the eyes, letting her see that I knew exactly what she'd done, that her act hadn't fooled me. Something flickered in her expression, a moment of genuine unease, before the mask slammed back into place. She turned away, calling for Sophia, and they walked together toward the line of luxury cars waiting to take mourners to the reception. I watched them go, rain soaking through my clothes, mud covering my black dress, and made a decision. Whatever game Victoria was playing, whatever she thought she'd accomplished by pushing me into my father's grave, she just made her first mistake. She'd shown her hand too early, revealed the depths of her hatred, and now I knew I was in a fight for my survival. I didn't go home that night. Instead, I checked into a cheap motel on the outskirts of town, paying cash for a room that smelled of cigarette smoke and cleaning chemicals. I needed time to think, to process everything that had happened, to figure out what I was going to do next. I sat on the sagging bed, staring at the water-stained ceiling, replaying the day's events in my mind. My father had been a billionaire who'd hidden his wealth from his own daughter, who'd let me believe we struggled financially while apparently funding foundations and building business empires. Why? What possible reason could he have had for lying to me my entire life? And Victoria, what was her role in all of this? Had she known about the money when she married him? Of course she had. No one that calculating ends up with a supposed accountant by accident. She'd targeted him, married him for his wealth, and now that he was dead, She intended to keep it all for herself and Sophia. That's why she'd pushed me into the grave. She wanted me gone, removed from the equation, eliminated as competition for the inheritance. But there was something she didn't know, something I'd learned during my visit to the hospital in those final days. I'd been going through my father's wallet while sitting vigil, looking for photos or mementos, anything to feel close to him, when I'd found a business card tucked behind his credit cards. It was simple, elegant, just a name and a phone number. The name was Harrison Blackwood, and beneath it, in small letters, was the title Private Attorney and Estate Executor. I'd almost thrown it away, assuming it was just another business contact, but something had made me pocket it instead, some instinct I didn't fully understand at the time. Now, lying in the motel room with bruises blooming across my shoulder and 100 questions burning in my mind, I pulled out that card and stared at it. This man, this Harrison Blackwood, he would have answers. He would know the truth about my father's wealth, about the will, about what I was entitled to. I needed to call him, but something held me back. If I contacted him too soon, Victoria would know I was taking action, and she'd already proven she was willing to hurt me to protect her interests. I needed to be smart, strategic, to gather information before making my move. I spent the next 3 days in that motel room, barely eating, barely sleeping, just thinking and planning. I used the room's ancient desktop computer to research my father, typing his name into search engines and watching in amazement as page after page of results appeared. There were articles about his business dealings, profiles in financial magazines, photos of him at charity galas and industry conferences, always with Victoria by his side, always smiling, always looking like someone I didn't recognize. I found references to companies I'd never heard of, to investments in startups that had become household names, to real estate holdings spread across multiple states. The estimated value of his estate varied depending on the source, but even the most conservative estimates put it in the billions. With a B, I had grown up shopping at thrift stores and clipping coupons while my father was literally a billionaire. The betrayal of it, the sheer insanity of the deception, made me physically ill. I spent an hour hunched over the toilet, vomiting up the anger and hurt and confusion that threatened to overwhelm me. When I finally stopped shaking, I washed my face and looked at myself in the cracked mirror. I looked terrible, pale and gaunt, dark circles under my eyes, hair tangled and unwashed. But there was something new in my expression, too, a hardness that hadn't been there before, a determination forged in the fires of my father's grave. Victoria thought she'd broken me with that push, thought she'd scared me into disappearing. She was about to learn how wrong she was. On the 4th day, I finally called Harrison Blackwood. The phone rang 3 times before a smooth professional voice answered, introducing himself and asking how he could help me. I identified myself as the daughter of the deceased, and there was a pause on the other end of the line, a beat of silence that felt loaded with significance. Then Blackwood asked me to hold, and I heard muffled conversation in the background before he returned. He told me he'd been expecting my call, that my father had left specific instructions regarding me, that we needed to meet in person as soon as possible to discuss matters of the utmost importance. His tone was grave, almost urgent, and I felt my pulse quicken. I agreed to meet him at his office the following morning, and he gave me an address in the financial district downtown, in a building I recognized as one of the most prestigious in the city. After we hung up, I sat holding the phone, my hand trembling slightly. Whatever was about to happen, whatever secrets were about to be revealed, there was no turning back now. I'd stepped onto a path that would either lead to truth and justice or destroy me completely. The next morning, I dressed carefully, choosing the one professional outfit I owned, a simple black suit I'd bought for job interviews. I wanted to look put together, competent, like someone who deserved answers rather than a grief-stricken girl who could be easily dismissed. I took a bus downtown, not trusting myself to drive given my emotional state, and stared out the window at the city passing by, wondering how many other people were hiding secrets as massive as my father's. The building where Blackwood's office was located was a tower of steel and glass that seemed to pierce the clouds, the kind of place where decisions affecting millions of lives were made daily. The lobby was all marble and modern art, security guards in suits scrutinizing everyone who entered. I gave my name at the desk, and the receptionist made a call before directing me to a private elevator that would take me directly to the 45th floor. As the elevator rose, my ears popping from the altitude, I tried to prepare myself for whatever I was about to learn, but there was no preparing for the truth that awaited me. Harrison Blackwood's office was everything I'd expected and more. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, expensive furniture that looked like it belonged in a museum, shelves lined with leather-bound law books that probably cost more than my car. The man himself was in his 60s, distinguished and silver-haired, with the kind of presence that came from decades of wielding power. He stood when I entered, coming around his massive desk to shake my hand, his grip firm but not aggressive, his eyes sharp and assessing as he took in my appearance. He gestured to a leather chair facing his desk, and I sat, feeling small in the cavernous space. He returned to his own chair and folded his hands on the desk, studying me for a long moment before speaking. What he said first surprised me. He told me he was sorry for my loss, but his tone suggested he was sorry for more than just my father's death, as if he were apologizing in advance for what he was about to reveal. He opened a drawer and pulled out a thick folder, setting it on the desk between us. This, he said, was my father's will, and its contents were going to change my life in ways I couldn't yet imagine. Blackwood began by confirming what I'd already discovered through my research. My father had indeed been a billionaire, one of the wealthiest men in the state, with assets totaling approximately $3.7 billion. The number was so large it didn't feel real, didn't connect to anything in my experience or understanding of the world. He explained that my father had made his fortune through a combination of early investments in technology companies, strategic real estate purchases, and the founding of several successful businesses that he'd later sold for massive profits. The question I'd been burning to ask finally burst out of me. Why had he hidden it? Why had he let me grow up thinking we were barely middle class when he had billions? Blackwood's expression softened, and he told me that my father had his reasons, reasons that were explained in a letter he'd left for me to be opened only after his death. The lawyer reached into the folder and pulled out an envelope, my name written on it in my father's distinctive handwriting. My hands shook as I took it, the paper feeling impossibly heavy, as if it contained all the weight of my father's secrets. Blackwood told me to take my time, that he'd step out to give me privacy, but I should read it there in his office rather than taking it with me. The implication was clear. Whatever was in this letter was sensitive enough that it couldn't leave this secure location. I opened the envelope with trembling fingers, pulling out several pages covered in my father's neat script. The letter began with an apology, my father's voice clear in the words, even though he was gone. He told me he loved me more than anything in the world, that every decision he'd made had been to protect me, even the ones that hurt me. He explained that my mother hadn't died in an accident as I'd been told. She'd been murdered, killed by people who were trying to get to him, to destroy him, and take what he'd built. The shock of that revelation made me gasp, tears instantly springing to my eyes. My mother murdered. All these years I'd believed it was just tragic bad luck, an accident that stole her from us too soon, but it had been violence, intentional and cruel. My father wrote that after her death, he'd realized his wealth made us targets, that anyone who knew how much money he had would see me as a potential victim, someone to kidnap or hurt to get to him. So he'd hidden his fortune, lived modestly, raised me in anonymity, all to keep me safe from the same fate that had befallen my mother. The letter went on to explain that when I'd gone to college, when I was out of his house and building my own life, he thought maybe it was finally safe to live more openly, to enjoy the fruits of his labor, to find happiness again. That's when he'd met Victoria, and he admitted in the letter that he'd made a terrible mistake. He'd been lonely, and she'd been beautiful and attentive, and he'd ignored the warning signs that she was only interested in his money. By the time he'd realized his error, they were already married, and he'd discovered she was far more dangerous than he'd anticipated. He'd learned through investigators he'd hired that Victoria had been married 3 times before, and all 3 of her previous husbands had died under suspicious circumstances, leaving her their fortunes. She was a professional, a black widow who identified wealthy older men, married them, and then arranged for their deaths. My father had realized too late that he was her next target, and he'd begun putting protections in place, changing his will, gathering evidence against her, preparing to have her arrested. But she'd moved faster than he'd expected, and he suspected that his final illness hadn't been natural, that she'd been poisoning him slowly, making it look like a heart condition. He'd tried to get proof, but by the time he'd realized what was happening, it was too late. His body was shutting down, and there was nothing the doctors could do. I had to stop reading for a moment, the paper shaking so badly in my hands I couldn't focus on the words. Victoria had killed my father. She'd murdered him, and she'd gotten away with it because who would suspect a devoted wife of slowly poisoning her husband? The grief and rage that washed over me were so intense I thought I might pass out, my vision tunneling as I struggled to breathe. I forced myself to continue reading, knowing my father wouldn't have told me all of this without a purpose. The letter's final pages contained instructions, a plan he'd laid out for me to follow. He'd rewritten his will entirely, leaving the bulk of his estate not to Victoria as she expected, but to me, his biological daughter and only heir. Victoria would receive a small allowance, just enough to avoid her contesting the will successfully, but the billions, the businesses, the real estate, all of it was mine. However, and this was crucial, the will contained a clause that Victoria didn't know about. If anything happened to me before the will was executed, if I died or disappeared or was incapacitated in any way, the entire estate would go to a foundation my father had established, and Victoria would receive nothing. My father had built in this protection because he knew Victoria would try to eliminate me, just as she'd eliminated him. He needed me to survive long enough for the will to be read, for the truth to come out, for Victoria to be exposed and arrested for her crimes. The letter ended with my father telling me he was sorry, sorry for lying to me all these years, sorry for putting me in danger by marrying Victoria, sorry for leaving me alone to face the consequences of his mistakes. He told me he'd try to protect me the only way he knew how, by keeping me separate from his wealth and the violence it attracted. But in doing so, he'd also kept me from knowing him, the real him, and that was his greatest regret. He wrote that everything in his empire, everything he'd built, was ultimately for me, so I would have security and freedom and choices he'd never had growing up poor. He begged me to be careful, to trust Harrison Blackwood completely because the lawyer had been with him for decades and was absolutely loyal, and to remember that I was stronger than I knew, that I came from survivors, and I would survive this too. The letter was signed simply, "With love always, Dad," and those 3 words broke something inside me. I dissolved into tears, sobbing so hard I couldn't catch my breath, grieving not just for the father I'd lost, but for the relationship we'd never had, the honesty that had been stolen from us by circumstance and fear. Harrison Blackwood returned after a discreet knock, and if he noticed my tear-stained face, he was professional enough not to comment. He handed me a box of tissues and waited patiently while I composed myself, and I was grateful for his tact, for treating me like an adult rather than a hysterical child. When I could finally speak, I asked him what happened next, what the plan was to execute my father's wishes and bring Victoria to justice. Blackwood explained that the will reading was scheduled for the following week, that Victoria had been pushing for it to happen sooner, but he'd been stalling, waiting for me to make contact as my father had predicted I would. At the reading, Victoria would learn that she'd been disinherited, that I was the primary beneficiary, and based on her history and my father's evidence, Blackwood expected her to make a move against me. That's why my father had arranged for protection, a security team that would be assigned to me immediately, professionals who would keep me safe, while also documenting any attempts Victoria made on my life. The goal was to let her incriminate herself, to give her enough rope to hang herself with, and then turn all the evidence over to the authorities for prosecution. It was risky, using me as bait, but it was also the only way to ensure Victoria faced justice for what she'd done to my father and her previous husbands. I should have been terrified by the plan, by the knowledge that I was being dangled like a worm on a hook to catch a killer, but instead I felt energized, purposeful, as if everything in my life had been leading to this moment. I told Blackwood I was in, that I wanted to do whatever it took to make Victoria pay for my father's death, and I saw approval in his eyes, respect for my resolve. He made a call, and within minutes, two people arrived at his office, a man and a woman in their 30s, who moved with the quiet confidence of trained professionals. Blackwood introduced them as my security detail, former federal agents who now worked in private protection, and they would be with me constantly until Victoria was in custody. They gave me their protocols, how we would communicate, what signals to use if I felt in danger, how to wear the wire they wanted me to use to record any conversations with Victoria. It was overwhelming, like stepping into a spy movie, but I forced myself to focus, to absorb every instruction, knowing my life literally depended on getting this right. We spent hours going over scenarios, preparing for different ways Victoria might try to approach me, role playing conversations until I could keep my voice steady and my face neutral, even when my heart was racing with fear. By the time we finished, night had fallen over the city, the office windows reflecting back my pale face against the darkness outside. Blackwood insisted I stay in a safe house rather than returning to my apartment or the motel, explaining that Victoria almost certainly had people watching my known locations, waiting for me to surface so she could track my movements. The security team drove me to a nondescript condo in a gated community, the kind of place designed for wealthy people who valued privacy over ostentation. Inside, it was comfortable but impersonal, clearly a property maintained for exactly this kind of temporary housing. They showed me the security features, the cameras, the reinforced doors, the panic buttons, hidden throughout the rooms, and I tried not to think about why all of this was necessary, what kind of danger I was really in. They left me alone to rest, taking up positions in a monitoring room where they could watch the building's entrances, and I collapsed onto the bed, exhausted beyond anything I'd ever experienced. Sleep didn't come easily, my mind replaying the day's revelations, processing the magnitude of what I'd learned. My father had been a billionaire who'd hidden his wealth to protect me. My mother had been murdered. Victoria was a serial killer, and I was now the heir to billions, which made me the next target. It was too much, too big, and I felt very small and very alone in that king-sized bed in a stranger's condo. But underneath the fear and grief was something else, something hard and sharp and hungry, a desire for justice that bordered on vengeance, a need to make Victoria pay that consumed every other emotion. She'd killed my father, stolen my chance to know him as he really was, pushed me into his grave like I was garbage to be disposed of. She was about to learn that I wasn't that easy to eliminate, that underestimating me was a mistake she wouldn't get a chance to repeat. The next few days passed in a strange limbo, waiting for the will reading, preparing for the confrontation to come. The security team kept me updated on Victoria's movements, telling me she was acting exactly as expected, consoling herself with expensive shopping trips and spa days, planning what was surely a celebration for when she officially inherited my father's billions. She'd been calling Harrison Blackwood's office daily, demanding he speed up the probate process, growing more aggressive when he cited legal procedures and necessary waiting periods. She didn't know that every delay was intentional, giving me time to prepare, allowing the security team to position themselves perfectly. I spent my time reading through documents Blackwood had sent over, learning about my father's businesses and investments, trying to understand the empire I was about to inherit. It was daunting, overwhelming, the sheer scale of responsibility that came with that kind of wealth. I understood now why my father had hidden it, why he'd wanted me to grow up normal, to develop a sense of self that wasn't defined by money. The person I'd become through struggling and working and earning my own way was stronger than the person I would have been if I'd grown up knowing I was a billionaire heiress. My father had given me that gift, even if it meant lying to me, even if it meant our relationship suffered for it. I couldn't forgive him for all of it, for the years of distance and deception, but I could understand his reasoning, and that understanding brought a measure of peace. On the day before the will reading, Harrison Blackwood called with unexpected news. Victoria had requested a private meeting with me, claiming she wanted to reconcile before we dealt with the estate matters to heal the rift between us that my father's death had made worse. It was exactly the kind of move Blackwood had predicted. Victoria trying to get me alone, to manipulate or threaten or eliminate me before I could claim my inheritance. He asked if I was ready to face her, and I said yes without hesitation, the word coming out stronger and more confident than I felt. We planned the meeting carefully, selecting a public location, but one where we could have privacy, a private room at an upscale restaurant that the security team could wire in advance. I would wear my recording device, and they would be in the next room, able to hear everything and intervene within seconds if necessary. The goal was to let Victoria reveal herself, to get her to admit what she'd done, to threaten me in clear enough terms that we'd have evidence to support the murder charges. It was dangerous sitting across from my father's killer and pretending I didn't know the truth, but it was also necessary, the final piece of the trap we were laying for her. I arrived at the restaurant early, letting the security team do their sweep and set up their equipment. The private room was elegant, low lighting, and expensive table settings, the kind of place where business deals and marriage proposals happened. I sat facing the door, my hands folded on the table to hide their shaking, my face composed into what I hoped was an expression of wary openness. When Victoria arrived, I was struck by how beautiful she looked, how put together and expensive, wearing a black dress that probably cost more than my car and jewelry that glittered in the soft light. She looked like exactly what she was, a wealthy widow in mourning, nothing in her appearance suggesting the monster I knew her to be. She sat across from me with fluid grace, ordering a bottle of wine I knew I wouldn't drink, and for a few minutes we made awkward small talk, dancing around the reason we were there. Then Victoria leaned forward, her face shifting into an expression of concern that didn't reach her cold eyes, and she asked me how I was healing from my fall at the cemetery. The emphasis she put on the word fall, the slight smirk playing at her lips, made it clear she was reminding me of what she'd done, asserting her power over me. I swallowed my rage and told her I was fine, just some bruises, nothing permanent, and I saw disappointment flicker across her face, as if she'd hoped I'd been hurt worse. Victoria got to the point quickly, perhaps sensing that I wasn't going to be as easy to manipulate as she'd hoped. She told me she knew the will reading was tomorrow, that she wanted us to go into it as allies rather than adversaries. She suggested that whatever my father had left me, we should consider it family money, pooled together for all of us to share. She painted a picture of us running my father's empire together, sisters in business and family, honoring his legacy by staying united. It was a pretty speech, delivered with apparent sincerity, but I could see the calculation in her eyes, the way she was watching my reactions to gauge how much I believed. I asked her what she thought my father had left me, and she waved a hand dismissively, saying probably some small inheritance, maybe a trust fund for education, the kind of thing fathers left daughters to be responsible. She clearly believed she was the primary beneficiary, that my father's billions were coming to her, and she was trying to make sure I didn't cause problems by accepting whatever scraps fell from her table. The audacity of it, the sheer confidence she had in her own manipulations, was almost impressive. She killed my father, and now she wanted me to thank her for allowing me a tiny piece of his estate. I decided to push her, to see how far she'd go to secure her position. I told her I'd been doing some research into my father's finances, that I'd discovered he was much wealthier than I'd realized, and I was curious why he'd hidden it from me all these years. Victoria's smile tightened, her eyes going flat and hard, and I knew I'd hit a nerve. She recovered quickly, saying my father had probably just been eccentric about money, that wealthy people often were, and it wasn't something I should concern myself with. Then she leaned even closer, her voice dropping to almost a whisper, and told me that sometimes it was better not to ask too many questions, not to dig into matters that were better left buried. Like my father, she added, and the threat in those 3 words was unmistakable. She was warning me to back off, to accept whatever she decided to give me, or I'd end up like him in the ground. The wire hidden under my shirt was recording every word, capturing the implied threat, and I forced myself to stay calm, to not react, to keep her talking. I asked her what she meant, my voice uncertain and afraid, playing the role of the intimidated daughter perfectly. Victoria studied me for a long moment, and I could see her deciding whether to push further or pull back. She chose to push, perhaps confident that she'd already broken me at the cemetery, that I was too scared to be a real threat. She told me that my father had been sick for a long time, that his heart had been weak, that it was only a matter of time before it gave out. The way she said it, with a slight emphasis on weak heart, made my skin crawl because I knew from his letter that she'd been poisoning him, inducing the exact symptoms she was now describing as natural. She continued, saying that the stress of having a difficult daughter, meaning me, had probably contributed to his decline. That family conflict was hard on a man his age. She was gaslighting me, trying to make me feel guilty for my father's death, even as she sat there having murdered him herself. The psychological manipulation was masterful, the kind of thing that would have worked on me a week ago, before I knew the truth. But now, sitting across from her with my father's letter burning in my memory, I could see through every tactic, every carefully chosen word designed to make me doubt myself. I played along, letting tears well up in my eyes, my voice breaking, as I asked if she really thought I'd contributed to his death. Victoria reached across the table and took my hand, her touch cold despite the warmth of the room, and told me that we all had regrets. But the best thing I could do now was honor my father's memory by not causing trouble, by accepting that his wealth should go to the woman who'd made his final years happy, meaning her. The conversation continued for another hour, Victoria carefully building her case for why I should surrender any claim to my father's estate, mixing threats with false sympathy, manipulation with outright intimidation. She told me stories about my father that I couldn't verify, claiming he'd been disappointed in me, that he'd confided in her about his concerns for my future, that he'd asked her to look after me because he didn't think I could manage on my own. Every word was designed to diminish me, to make me feel small and incapable and dependent on her goodwill. In another life, without the knowledge I now possessed, I might have believed her, might have internalized her assessment of my worth. But I'd read my father's letter, seen the love in his words, known that everything he'd done was to protect me, and Victoria's lies just bounced off the armor that truth had provided. When she finally ran out of ways to manipulate me, when she'd exhausted her repertoire of psychological tricks, she stood to leave, reminding me one final time that tomorrow's will reading would go much smoother if I came in with the right attitude. As she walked past my chair, she leaned down and whispered directly in my ear, so close I could smell her expensive perfume. She told me that accidents happened, that young women living alone could be vulnerable, that it would be a shame if something happened to me before I had a chance to enjoy whatever small inheritance my father left me. Then she was gone, sweeping out of the room in a cloud of silk and threat, leaving me shaking in my chair. The security team entered seconds after Victoria left, and I could see the grim satisfaction on their faces. They'd heard everything, recorded it all, and while it wasn't a direct confession, it was enough to establish intent, enough to support the murder charges when combined with the other evidence. They told me I'd done well, that I'd handled Victoria perfectly, that tomorrow would be the final act. I should have felt triumphant, satisfied that we were close to justice, but instead I just felt exhausted and dirty, as if Victoria's presence had contaminated me. I let them drive me back to the safe house, barely aware of the city passing outside the tinted windows, my mind replaying the dinner over and over. The casual way Victoria had threatened me, the complete lack of remorse or conscience, the absolute confidence that she could eliminate me as easily as she'd eliminated my father, it was chilling. This was a woman who'd killed at least 4 husbands that we knew of, who'd perfected murder into an art form, who viewed people as nothing more than obstacles or assets. And tomorrow she was going to learn that she'd finally met an obstacle she couldn't remove. The will reading was scheduled for 10 in the morning at Harrison Blackwood's office. I dressed carefully, choosing a simple but expensive outfit that projected confidence and belonging. Nothing in my appearance suggesting I was the struggling student Victoria believed me to be. My security team briefed me one final time, reminding me to stay calm no matter what Victoria did, to let Blackwood control the proceedings, to trust that they would handle any threats. They would be in the building, positioned strategically, ready to move instantly if needed. I felt surprisingly calm as we drove downtown, a strange clarity that came from knowing the end was near, that after today everything would be resolved one way or another. We arrived early, and Blackwood met me in his office, giving me a final reassuring talk, reminding me that I was my father's daughter, that I had every right to be here, that the empire I was about to inherit was mine by blood and by his wishes. His confidence in me was steadying, and I felt myself straighten, shoulders going back, chin lifting, inhabiting the role I was about to assume. When Victoria and Sophia arrived, I was already seated in the conference room, positioned at the head of the table like I belonged there, and I saw surprise flicker across Victoria's face before she masked it with her usual composure. She'd expected me to be intimidated, to shrink into the corner, but instead I was claiming space, asserting my right to be here. It was a small victory, but it felt significant. Harrison Blackwood called the meeting to order with formal gravity, explaining that we were gathered for the reading of my father's last will and testament, that the document was legally binding and had been properly executed, that anyone wishing to contest its provisions would need to file within the specified legal timeframe. Victoria sat with her hands folded, the picture of a patient widow, while Sophia looked bored, presumably expecting this to be a quick formality before they could access the billions. I kept my face neutral, revealing nothing, watching Blackwood as he opened the leather portfolio containing my father's will. He began with the standard legal language, the declarations and revocations that preceded the actual distribution of assets. Then he got to the heart of it, the bequests and inheritances that would reshape all our lives. He read that Victoria would receive an annual allowance of $200,000, paid from a trust established for that purpose, for the remainder of her life or until she remarried. It was a generous amount by normal standards, but Victoria's face went white as she processed what that meant, that she was getting an allowance, not the estate, not the billions she'd expected. Sophia looked confused, glancing at her mother, not yet understanding the implications. Blackwood continued reading, his voice steady and professional, explaining that the bulk of the estate, including all business holdings, real estate, investments, and liquid assets, was being left to my father's biological daughter, to me. He read my name clearly, formally, along with the estimated value of the inheritance. $3.7 billion. The number hung in the air, massive and impossible, changing everything. Victoria stood so abruptly her chair fell backward, the crash echoing in the conference room. Her face had gone from white to red, fury twisting her features into something ugly, all pretense of composure evaporating in an instant. She screamed that this was impossible, that the will was fake, that I must have manipulated my father, that she was his wife and she had rights. Blackwood remained calm, letting her rage, and when she finally ran out of breath, he calmly explained that the will had been executed properly, witnessed by 3 independent parties, filed with the court, and beyond contestation. He added that my father had left a detailed letter explaining his reasoning, copies of which could be provided to her attorney if she wished to pursue legal action, though he advised against it, given the evidence the letter contained regarding her history. The threat was subtle, but clear. If Victoria tried to fight this, the evidence of her previous murders would come out, and she'd face criminal charges instead of just losing the inheritance. Victoria understood. I saw the moment it clicked, the calculation in her eyes as she weighed her options. Then she turned those eyes on me, and I saw pure murder in them, the mask completely gone, revealing the predator underneath. She told me I would never get to enjoy that money, that I wouldn't survive long enough to spend a single dollar of it, that I'd made a fatal mistake thinking I could cross her. It was exactly the kind of threat we needed, explicit and recorded, the security team in the next room capturing every word. Before Victoria could say more, before she could actually attack me physically, which I could see her considering, Harrison Blackwood pressed a button on the conference table and the door opened. Two police detectives entered, showing their badges, asking Victoria to remain calm and have a seat. Victoria froze, confusion replacing rage on her face, looking between the detectives and Blackwood with an expression that would have been comical if the situation weren't so serious. The lead detective introduced himself and explained that they had several questions regarding the deaths of her previous husbands, that new evidence had come to light suggesting foul play, that they needed her to come to the station for formal questioning. Victoria's lawyer persona kicked in. She demanded to know what evidence, on what grounds they were questioning her, threatening lawsuits and harassment charges. The detective calmly explained that they had testimony from medical experts who'd reviewed her husband's medical records, financial records showing suspicious patterns, and recorded statements suggesting intent to harm. He didn't specify what recordings, but Victoria's eyes darted to me, and I saw understanding dawn. She knew she'd been set up, that the meeting yesterday had been a trap, that every word she'd said had been captured and was now being used against her. The fury that exploded from her then was terrifying. She lunged across the table at me, screaming that I was a conniving little snake, that I'd planned this all along, that she should have pushed me harder into that grave. Her confession, her admission of pushing me, was the final piece, and the detectives moved quickly to restrain her, pulling her away from the table before she could reach me. As they handcuffed Victoria, reading her rights, Sophia sat in shock, tears streaming down her face, her perfect world collapsing around her. I felt a moment of pity for her, despite everything, because she'd been raised by a monster, shaped by Victoria's values and manipulations, and she'd never had a chance to be anything else. But the pity was fleeting, because Sophia had made her own choices, had participated in making my life miserable, and now she would face the consequences of aligning herself with her mother. The detectives led Victoria out, and as she passed my chair, she spat at me, the saliva landing on my sleeve. It was her final act of defiance, pathetic and impotent, the gesture of someone who'd lost completely and knew it. I didn't react, didn't give her the satisfaction of seeing me disturbed, just sat still and calm as they removed her from the room. Sophia followed in a daze, ignored by everyone, already irrelevant, now that her mother's schemes had been exposed. The door closed behind them, and suddenly the conference room was silent, except for the sound of my own breathing. It was over. Victoria was in custody, the estate was mine, my father's murder would be investigated, and justice would be served. I should have felt victorious, but instead I felt hollow, drained, as if I'd been holding myself together through pure will, and now that the crisis had passed, I was coming apart. Harrison Blackwood gave me a moment to collect myself before speaking. He told me there would be legal proceedings, that Victoria would almost certainly be charged with multiple murders, that I would need to testify about the cemetery incident and the threats she'd made. He explained that managing an estate this size would be a full-time job, that I would need to assemble a team, lawyers and financial advisors and business managers, people I could trust to help me navigate this new world. He offered to continue as my primary attorney, to guide me through the transition, and I accepted gratefully, knowing I would need his experience and knowledge. We spent the next hour going over immediate concerns, accounts that needed to be secured, properties that needed management, business decisions that couldn't wait. It was overwhelming, the sheer scope of responsibility I'd just inherited, but it was also strangely grounding, giving me something concrete to focus on instead of the emotional chaos of the last 2 weeks. By the time we finished, I was exhausted but also clearer, with a sense of purpose I hadn't had since my father's death. This was my life now, not the life I'd imagined or wanted, but the life I'd been given, and I would honor my father's memory by doing it justice. In the weeks that followed, I learned the truth of what it meant to be a billionaire, The money itself was almost abstract, numbers and accounts so large they were meaningless. But the power that came with it was very real. People deferred to me, sought my approval, treated my opinions as if they mattered, because now they did matter. Now I controlled resources that could change lives and reshape industries. It was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure, and I understood why my father had wanted to shield me from it, why he'd let me grow up normal. The businesses I now owned employed thousands of people whose livelihoods depended on decisions I made. The foundations distributed millions to causes around the world, and I had to choose which ones to support and how much to give. The properties included homes I'd never seen in cities I'd never visited, and I had to decide whether to keep or sell them, whether to live in any of them or maintain my modest lifestyle. Every choice had weight, had consequences that rippled outward, affecting people I'd never meet, and that responsibility was crushing at times. But I also found unexpected joy in it, in learning about my father's businesses, understanding the vision he'd had, continuing the work he'd started. I discovered that I had inherited not just his money, but also his mind for strategy, his ability to see connections and opportunities others missed, and that maybe I was suited for this after all. Victoria's trial became a media sensation. The beautiful black widow accused of murdering four wealthy husbands for their money. The prosecution built an overwhelming case, medical evidence showing all four men had been poisoned with the same rare compound, financial records proving Victoria had inherited massive estates from each one, testimony from investigators about her pattern of targeting wealthy older men. My testimony about the cemetery incident and her subsequent threats was particularly damaging, painting her as someone so desperate to eliminate competition she'd tried to kill her stepdaughter at her husband's funeral. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Victoria was sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole, 4 consecutive life sentences that ensured she would die behind bars. I attended the sentencing, sitting in the gallery with Harrison Blackwood beside me, watching as Victoria's mask finally cracked completely. She cried in rage and blamed everyone but herself, claiming she'd been framed, that I had manipulated the evidence, that my father had poisoned himself, and tried to make it look like she did it. No one believed her. The evidence was too strong, her history too damning, and ultimately she was just a narcissistic killer trying to escape accountability for her crimes. As they led her away to begin her sentence, she looked at me one final time, and I looked back steadily, letting her see that I wasn't afraid anymore, that I'd won, that she'd failed. It was the closure I needed, the final confirmation that justice had been served. Sophia disappeared after the trial, leaving the country according to the investigators who'd kept loose tabs on her. She'd been cleared of direct involvement in any of the murders, but her reputation was destroyed, and she couldn't stay in the city where everyone knew her mother was a serial killer. I heard rumors she'd moved to Europe, that she'd changed her name and was trying to start over, and I found I didn't care enough to verify them. She'd played a supporting role in making my life miserable, but she'd also been a victim of her mother's manipulation in her own way, and I could let that go. My focus was on building something positive from the ashes of tragedy, using the resources my father left me to do good in the world. I expanded his foundations, creating new programs to help young women escape domestic violence, to support children who'd lost parents, to fund education for underprivileged students. I found meaning in the giving, in using money that had attracted so much evil to create something beautiful instead. I also made peace with my father's choices, understanding them in a way I never could have before I inherited his burden. The wealth, the responsibility, the constant awareness that people wanted things from you, saw you as a resource rather than a person. It was isolating and dangerous, and I understood why he'd wanted to protect me from it. Would I have preferred to grow up knowing him better, having honesty between us instead of secrets? Of course, but I also recognized that every decision he made came from love, from a desperate father's need to keep his daughter safe after losing his wife to violence. He'd given me the greatest gift he could, a normal childhood, time to develop my identity and values without the distorting influence of extreme wealth. And now that I had both the memories of that simpler life and the resources of my current reality, I could navigate between them, staying grounded while wielding power. It was what he'd hoped for, the balance he'd tried to create through his deceptions, and I was determined to prove his faith in me hadn't been misplaced. A year after the trial, I stood in the same cemetery where Victoria had pushed me into my father's grave. I'd had his body moved to a different location, a quiet spot under an old oak tree where the light filtered through the leaves in dappled patterns. I'd commissioned a simple headstone, nothing ostentatious, just his name and dates, and a line from his letter to me. Everything was always for you. I visited regularly, talking to him about my decisions, about the businesses and the foundations, about the life I was building with the tools he'd left me. I told him about the struggles and the victories, about the people I'd helped and the mistakes I'd made, about how I was learning to carry the weight of the legacy he'd left. I didn't know if he could hear me, didn't know if any part of him persisted beyond death, but it comforted me to speak the words anyway, to maintain that connection across the boundary of the grave. On this particular visit, the anniversary of his death, I brought flowers and a letter I'd written, my own accounting of the year, sealed in an envelope I would bury beside his headstone. As I dug the small hole to place it, my fingers brushed against something in the dirt, something that hadn't been there before. I pulled it out carefully, brushing away the soil, and found myself holding a small jewelry box, weathered but intact. Inside was a locket I recognized from photographs, my mother's locket, the one she'd been wearing the day she died. I opened it with shaking hands and found two tiny photos inside, one of me as a baby and one of my father, young and smiling, full of hope for the future they'd planned together. On the back of his photo in my mother's handwriting were three words that made me cry: our beautiful family. He'd kept it all these years, this reminder of what he'd lost, and he'd arranged for it to be left here for me to find, one final gift from beyond the grave. I clasped the locket around my neck, feeling the weight of it settle against my heart, a physical reminder of the family I'd come from, the love that had shaped me even through loss and secrets and terrible mistakes. I was their daughter, my mother's courage and my father's strategic mind, and I carried their legacy forward every day. Victoria had tried to destroy that legacy, to erase me and claim what wasn't hers, but she'd failed. I stood at my father's grave, no longer the girl who'd been pushed into it, but the woman who'd climbed out stronger, and I made a promise. I promised to use the wealth wisely, to protect the vulnerable, to be the person my parents had hoped I would become. I promised to live fully, to embrace both the responsibility and the opportunity that came with my inheritance. And I promised to remember to never let the money insulate me from humanity, to stay connected to the woman I'd been before I knew I was a billionaire. That woman, the struggling student who worked part-time jobs and shopped at thrift stores, she was still in me, still the foundation of who I was, and she would keep me honest as I navigated this new life. As I walked away from the cemetery that day, the locket warm against my skin, I felt lighter than I had in months. The grief would never fully disappear. The questions about what might have been if my father had lived, if my mother had never been killed, if we'd been able to be a normal family. But I could live with those questions, could accept that some things would never be resolved or understood, could move forward anyway because that's what survivors do. I was building something meaningful from the ruins of my father's secrets and Victoria's evil, creating a life that honored the sacrifices made and the love that had tried, however imperfectly, to protect me. I was healing slowly, finding joy in the work and the giving and the knowledge that I was exactly where I was supposed to be. My father had called me stronger than I knew, and he'd been right. I'd survived betrayal and murder attempts and the crushing weight of sudden wealth, and I was still standing, still fighting, still choosing to hope that tomorrow would be better than today. That was my inheritance, not just the billions in the bank accounts, but the resilience in my bones, the determination in my heart, the refusal to let evil win. Victoria had pushed me into a grave and expected me to stay there, buried and forgotten. Instead, I'd climbed out and claimed an empire. It was the greatest revenge I could have imagined. Not just surviving, but thriving. Not just defeating her, but transforming her attempt to destroy me into the catalyst for becoming more than I'd ever dreamed possible. My father would have been proud, I thought, and that knowledge was worth more than all the billions he'd left behind. Did you like the story? And which city are you listening from? Let's meet in the comments. If you like the story, you can support me by sending a super thanks so I can keep bringing more stories like this. Thank you so much for your sweet support. I'm looking forward to your comments on the story. On the screen, you can see 2 new live stories that I highly recommend. There's so much more on my channel. Don't forget to subscribe. See you in the next live story with love and respect.